The woman didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her arm and pointed down the road. Without thinking, Mark's gaze followed the direction of her gesture. The road disappeared into the darkness, and the oppressive trees loomed even closer together ahead. When he looked back, she was gone. Mark rubbed his eyes, certain he was overturned. He checked the mirrors, peering into the murky night. Nothing. The road was empty. Swallowing hard, he pressed on, telling himself he just needed to finish the deliveries and get some rest. The miles ticked by slowly. The rain began to let up, but the fog thickened, curling around the van like spectral fingers. His GPS flickered, recalculating every few minutes. The voice that guided him now sounded distorted, almost amused. He silenced it, relying instead on his memory of the route. The air inside the van grew colder. Mark could see his breath now, fogging the inside of the windshield. He reached for the heater controls, but they wouldn't respond. "Great," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Just great." Suddenly, the van shuddered violently, as if it had hit something. Mark's hands flew to the wheel, fighting to keep control. He came to a screeching halt on the shoulder, heart racing. He sat there, gripping the wheel, until he worked up the courage to step out and check. The night was eerily silent now. The rain had stopped entirely, and even the frogs and crickets seemed to have gone mute. Mark's boots crunched on the gravel as he circled the van. His flashlight beam danced nervously across the ground. There was nothing. No damage to the van. No sign of an impact. But just as he turned to climb back into the driver's seat, he saw it. A handprint on the fogged rear window. It was too large to be his own and smeared, as though someone, or something, had pressed against the glass from the outside. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing into the void. No reply, only the weight of the silence. He climbed back into the van, locking the doors with shaking hands. His pulse was deafening in his ears. The headlights pierced the fog ahead, but the world beyond the beam seemed impenetrable. Determined to get back to town, Mark started the engine and pushed forward. The road felt longer now, impossible. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had stopped. The GPS flickered again, displaying random symbols before going dark altogether. Mark's sense of direction began to falter. He should have seen the town's lights by now. Instead, the woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees looming closer to the van. Then, a sound. A low, guttural growl came from behind him. Mark's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "No," he whispered, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was not an animal. It was too human. Mark's resolve broke, and he glanced up into the mirror. For a split second, he saw it. A figure crouched in the shadows of the back, but its eyes gleaming unnaturally bright. Mark screamed and swerved, the van careening off the road and into a ditch. The impact jarred him, and darkness claimed him as his head hit the steering wheel. When he came to, the van was still. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and gasoline. His head throbbed, and his vision swam. He fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. Gathering his strength, he pushed the door open and stepped out. The forest was unnervingly quiet. The road was gone, swallowed by the fog. In the distance, Mark thought he saw lights, faint, flickering, and impossibly far. With no other choice, he started walking. Mark trudged through the fog, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. The faint lights in the distance seemed to beckon him, but the forest grew darker and more oppressive with every step. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, flickering as if alive, but when he turned to look, there was nothing but the dense, gnarled trees. "Stay calm," Mark whispered to himself, though his voice trembled. His footsteps crunched against the forest floor, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. Yet, even that felt wrong. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if there were someone else walking just behind him. He stopped suddenly, holding his breath. The faint sound of another pair of steps stopped as well. His pulse quickened. Slowly, Mark turned around, his flashlight cutting weakly through the fog. "Hello," he called, the word barely more than a whisper. Silence answered. He shook his head and pressed on, the lights ahead growing slightly brighter. "It's just my mind playing tricks," he muttered, gripping the flashlight tightly. Just the stress, and the crash. The lights began to take shape as he drew closer, lanterns swaying gently from unseen branches. Mark frowned. The lanterns lined a narrow path, twisting deeper into the forest. They weren't part of the road, but he felt an inexplicable pull to follow them. Maybe someone had set them up. Maybe help was ahead. Cautiously, he stepped onto the path. The forest seemed to close in around him as the lanterns led him deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, each breath a puff of fog that lingered unnaturally long before dissipating. Mark kept his flashlight trained ahead, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. The lanterns provided the only real light, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. Then he heard it, a soft, melodic humming. It came from somewhere ahead, carried on the chill breeze. The sound was almost comforting, like a lullaby, but there was something unsettling beneath it, like a faint discordant note. "Hello?" Mark called again, his voice cracking. He quickened his pace, drawn by the sound and the lights. The humming grew louder, but the melodies seemed to shift, becoming more fragmented, less human. He tried to convince himself that someone was ahead, someone who could help him. The path ended abruptly, opening into a small clearing. In the center stood a decrepit wooden house, its windows dark and lifeless. The lanterns stopped here, their flames guttering as if reluctant to remain. Mark hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. The humming had stopped. He took a step forward, then another. The house loomed over him, its warped planks groaning softly in the wind. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to move closer. "Hello," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open wider, as if inviting him in. Mark swallowed hard. "I just need help. My van. I crashed, and..." His words died in his throat as he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just beyond the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the warped ceiling. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glinted in the dim light, just as they had in the van. Mark took a step back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "I don't want any trouble," he stammered. The figure didn't move. It stood there, silent and still, its presence radiating an unnatural wrongness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mark stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. The lanterns around the clearing flickered wildly, their flames threatening to extinguish. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the house, vibrating through the air and into Mark's chest. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through him. Without another thought, he turned and ran back toward the path, the forest closing in around him once more. But the path was gone. Mark skidded to a stop, his flashlight darting wildly through the trees. The lanterns had vanished, leaving him alone in the suffocating darkness. "No, no, no," he whispered, spinning in place. The forest was silent, save for his ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Cold, skeletal fingers digging into his skin. He froze, every muscle locking in place. Slowly, he turned his head. Nothing was there. Mark stumbled forward, panic overtaking him. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he pushed through the underbrush, his flashlight barely illuminating the ground in front of him. The humming returned, but now it was all around him, louder and more fragmented. It was no longer melodic, but a cacophony of voices, whispering, laughing, crying. Mark clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, drilling into his thoughts. Suddenly, he burst into another clearing. This one was different, cold and sterile, bathed in an unnatural white light. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface slick with something dark and wet. Mark's stomach churned as he approached, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. On the altar lay a small weathered box, its lid slightly open. Mark hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his body refused to obey. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the box. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed in his mind, "You shouldn't have come." Mark's vision blurred as the world around him began to twist and fracture. The trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. The ground beneath his feet shifted, pulling him toward the altar. And then, everything went black. Mark awoke to the sound of whispers. At first, they were faint, like the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. But as his senses returned, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, a chaotic tangle of voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on the cold, damp ground. The forest was gone. Instead, he was surrounded by an endless expanse of gray mist. The ground beneath him was neither soil nor stone, but something soft and yielding, like ash. He sat up, his head pounding, and tried to focus. The altar, the box, both were gone. The unnatural light of the clearing had been replaced by an oppressive, murky twilight. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and weak. His words seemed to dissolve into the mist, swallowed by the relentless whispers. Mark got to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. He turned in slow circles, searching for any sign of path, a landmark, anything. But the mist stretched endlessly in all directions, an infinite void. The oppressive air felt thick and heavy, as though it resisted every breath he took. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mark covered his ears, but it was no use. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head. He stumbled forward blindly, his flashlight still clutched in his hand, its beam piercing the fog for only a few feet before being swallowed. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Mark froze, his breath caught in his throat. Then, from somewhere behind him, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a human. Mark spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam landed on nothing but swirling mist. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the void. The footsteps continued, closer now, each one sending vibrations through the ground. Mark backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to steady the flashlight, sweeping it frantically through the fog. Then he saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall and broad, moving toward him. The figure stepped closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was humanoid but grown, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally fluid. Its face was obscured by the mist, but its eyes burned like embers, piercing the gloom with an unnatural light. Mark turned and ran. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, each step sinking slightly into the ash-like surface. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices urging him to stop, to turn back, to surrender. He pushed forward, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The shadow followed, its footsteps relentless. Up ahead, through the mist, Mark spotted a faint glow. A flicker of hope surged through him as he ran toward it, the light growing brighter with each step. It was a doorway, an arched opening set into a wall that hadn't been there moments before. Beyond the doorway was a warm, golden light, beckoning him. Mark didn't hesitate. He dove through the archway just as the shadow reached out, its elongated fingers grazing his back. He tumbled to the ground, the light enveloping him. When he looked up, he was in a room. It was small, dimly lit by a single hanging bolt that swayed gently, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. The whispers had stopped. Mark pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. What is this place?" he murmured. The room had no windows, only a single wooden door at the far end. The walls were lined with shelves, each one cluttered with objects. A rusted pocket watch, a cracked mirror, a pair of old, dusty shoes. Mark's gaze lingered on the items. They felt wrong, as though they were watching him. He moved cautiously toward the door, his footsteps creaking on the warped floorboards. When he reached for the doorknob, a faint giggle echoed through the room. Mark froze, his hand hovering inches from the knob. "Don't leave," a childlike voice whispered, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mark spun around, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. The shelves were empty now, their contents gone. The room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and warping like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. "Who's there?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of small running footsteps. They circled him, faster and faster, until Mark felt dizzy trying to follow them. "Stop," he shouted, slamming his hands over his ears. The room went silent. Mark lowered his hands cautiously, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The door was gone. The room had changed, its walls now covered in peeling wallpaper stained with dark, oozing streaks. The single light bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. Mark turned in circles, searching for a way out. His flashlight dimmed, its beam weakening with each passing second. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking it desperately. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out. Darkness swallowed him. Mark's breathing grew ragged as he fumbled for his phone. The screen glowed weakly, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. He switched on its flashlight and held it high, illuminating the room once more. The shelves were back, their objects rearranged. In the center of the room, where there had been nothing moments before, now stood a chair. On it sat a doll, old, porcelain, and cracked, its eyes unnervingly lifelike. The doll's head tilted slightly, and its mouth moved. "Why did you come here?" It asked in a voice that was not its own, a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down Mark's spine. Mark stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The light spun wildly, casting eerie shadows that made the room seem alive. The doll stood, its limbs moving with unnatural stiffness. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, stepping closer. Mark scrambled for his phone, grabbing it just as the doll reached him. He shone the light directly into its face, and it shrieked, a piercing, inhuman sound that made his ears ring. Without thinking, Mark ran, throwing himself against the wall where the door had been. The wood splintered under his weight, and he fell through into the misty void beyond. The whispers returned, louder than ever. Mark hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, his body aching and his head pounding. Around him, the mist swirled thick and suffocating, whispering his name now, softly at first, then louder, more insistent. "Mark, Mark." The voices layered over each other, some taunting, some pleading, others filled with malice. He covered his ears, but it was useless. The sound seemed to come from inside his skull, rattling his thoughts. "Get out of my head," he screamed, his voice raw. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere deep within the mist, came a slow, deliberate clap, It echoed unnaturally, as though the sound bent and stretched through the void. Mark scrambled to his feet, his phone flashlight barely piercing the gloom. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. He spun in circles, the beam darting frantically through the mist. "Show yourself." A figure emerged, stepping forward with an unsettling calm. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow, his eyes black voids that reflected no light. He wore a long, tattered coat that seemed to flow unnaturally, as though it were part of the mist itself. "You," the man said, his voice low and smooth, almost hypnotic. "You have wandered too far." Mark stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in his grip. "I didn't mean to. My van crashed, and..." The man raised a hand, silencing him. "Excuses," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You ignored the warnings, the voices, the signs, and now..." He tilted his head, studying Mark like a predator sizing up its prey. "Now you're here." Mark shook his head, his pulse racing. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just want to get back home." The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. "There is no home for you now." Before Mark could respond, the ground beneath him shifted. The ashen surface cracked and split, glowing red as if the earth itself were bleeding. He stumbled, falling to his knees as the air grew hot and thick with the stench of sulfur. The man stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate, unaffected by the chaos around him. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice echoing as though it came from every direction. "The weight of your choices, the pull of this place. It has claimed you." Mark tried to crawl away, his hands sinking into the soft, crumbling ground. "I didn't choose this," he cried, his voice cracking. "I didn't." "You did," the man interrupted, his tone cold and final. "The moment you ignored the first warning, the moment you crossed the threshold." Mark shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, this isn't fair. I didn't know." The man crouched before him, his black eyes locking onto Mark's. "Fairness is a human concept. Here, there is only consequence." Mark's vision blurred as the heat intensified. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, each voice screaming over the other. The ground beneath him crumbled further, and he felt himself sinking, the red glow swallowing him inch by inch. "Help me," he screamed, reaching out toward the man. "Please." The man didn't move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. "You were warned," he said again, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Just as Mark's body was nearly engulfed, the whispers stopped. The ground beneath him solidified, and the heat vanished. He gasped for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and terror. When he looked up, the man was gone. Mark staggered to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. The mist around him had thinned slightly, revealing a faint, winding path ahead. It was lined with dark, twisted trees that seemed to reach for him with their skeletal branches. "You must keep moving," a voice whispered, soft and feminine, yet laced with urgency. Mark spun around, searching for the source. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees, a woman, her face pale and ethereal, her eyes glowing faintly like embers. She was dressed in a flowing, tattered gown that billowed as if caught in an unseen breeze. "You don't have much time," she said, her voice calm but insistent. Mark backed away, his instincts screaming at him to run. "Who are you?" he asked. "What is this place?" The woman raised a hand, pointing down the path. "This is a crossroads, a place where the lost linger. If you wish to leave, you must follow the path. But beware." "Beware of what?" Mark interrupted, his fear and frustration bubbling over. Her expression darkened, and her glowing eyes bore into him. Beware of the things that dwell here. They do not take kindly to trespassers. Mark hesitated, glancing down the path. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a dark tunnel. "And if I don't follow it?" he asked. The woman's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in her expression. "Then you would remain here," she said simply, "forever." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't trust her, but he had no other options. He nodded and took a hesitant step forward. "Good," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep moving. Do not stop. And no matter what you hear or see, do not stray from the path." Mark turned to ask another question, but she was gone. The mist swirled where she had stood, fading into the gloom. Taking a deep breath, Mark began to walk. The path felt unstable beneath his feet, shifting slightly with every step. The trees loomed closer, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out what little light there was. Then came the sounds, soft at first, like distant laughter, but growing louder and more distinct. Voices called his name, some familiar, others unknown. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, darting between the trees. "Stay on the path," he whispered to himself, clutching his flashlight tightly. "Just stay on the path." But the voices grew louder, more insistent. They pleaded, begged, screamed. Some sounded like his family, others like friends long forgotten. Each step became harder, as though the ground itself were trying to pull him down. "Mark," a voice whispered, close to his ear. He froze, his flashlight shaking. Slowly, he turned his head. Nothing was there. Heart pounding, he forced himself to keep moving, his eyes fixed on the faint glow at the end of the path. But the voices wouldn't stop, and the shadows were closing in. Mark began to run. Mark's footsteps pounded against the unstable path, each step sending tremors through the shifting ground. The voices around him blended into a chaotic storm of sound that seemed to burrow into his mind. Shadows darted closer, their jagged shapes stretching unnaturally across the darkened trees. "Just keep moving," he shouted to himself, his voice drowned by the cacophony. The faint glow ahead flickered, as though taunting him with its distance. Mark's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. He could feel them now, whatever they were, closing in behind him. The air grew colder with each step, biting at his skin and numbing his fingers. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted violently. Mark stumbled, falling hard onto his hands and knees. The flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting a jagged line through the darkness before going out. Panic surged through him as he scrambled for the light, his fingers clawing at the cold, shifting earth. Behind him, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, oppressive. Mark froze, his hand hovering over the flashlight. Slowly, he turned his head. His breath caught in his throat. They were there. Dozens of shadowy figures stood just beyond the edge of the path, their forms barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. Their eyes, glowing, malevolent, were the only things visible, fixed intently on him. They didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, like a tidal wave of malice pressing down on him. Mark grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the gloom. The figures didn't flinch, didn't recoil from the light. Instead, they began to move, stepping closer with unnatural, jerky movements. "No," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Stay back." The figures didn't stop. Their movements quickened, the sound of their shuffling feet growing louder, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Mark scrambled to his feet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. He aimed it at the nearest figure, but the light passed through it, illuminating nothing but empty air. "Run," a voice whispered, soft, urgent, and terrifyingly close. Mark didn't wait to see who, or what, had spoken. He turned and bolted down the path, the flashlight bobbing wildly in his hand. The glow ahead grew brighter now, pulsating like a heartbeat. It was closer, but so were they. The shadows surged forward, their movements faster, more frantic. Mark could hear them now, low growls and guttural whispers that made his skin crawl. He didn't dare look back. His only focus was the light ahead. As he ran, the path began to twist and split, branching off in impossible directions. Each fork seemed to lead deeper into the forest, the trees tightening their grip on the narrow trail. Mark hesitated at the first split, his instincts screaming at him to choose wisely. Left, the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. Mark veered left without thinking, his feet skidding on the loose ground. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting into his lungs like glass. The glow pulsed ahead, drawing him forward, but the path seemed endless. Each step felt like a battle against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. Mark fell, tumbling down a steep incline, the flashlight slipping from his grasp. He hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind from him. For a moment, he lay there dazed, the world spinning around him. When he opened his eyes, the glow was gone. The forest was gone. Mark sat up, his hands trembling. He was in a different place now, a vast, open field bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The ground was covered in a thick, black sludge that clung to his hands and clothes. The sky above was a swirling mass of gray and red, like a storm frozen in time. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. A figure appeared on the horizon, a solitary silhouette standing perfectly still. It was far away, but Mark could feel its presence, its gaze piercing through the distance. He didn't want to move toward it, but the field seemed to stretch infinitely in every other direction. There was no other choice. With shaky legs, he rose and began walking. Each step was a struggle. The sludge sucked at his feet, threatening to pull him under. The air was thick, heavy, and filled with the faint stench of decay. The figure didn't move, but it grew larger, closer, with each step he took. As Mark drew nearer, he realized the figure was not human, or at least, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was featureless, a smooth expanse of darkness that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. Mark stopped several feet away, his body trembling. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his question. When it spoke, its voice was like 1,000 whispers layered over each other, dissonant and chilling. "You are not supposed to be here." Mark shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to come here. I didn't have a choice." "There is always a choice," the figure replied, stepping closer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly fluid. Mark stumbled back, his feet slipping in the sludge. "Please," he begged. "Let me go. I just want to go home." The figure stopped, its head tilting again. "Home? There is no home for you now." Mark's knees gave out, and he collapsed into the muck, sobbing. "What do you mean? Why me?" The figure raised one long, spindly arm, pointing behind him. Mark turned, his breath catching as he saw it. A doorway, glowing faintly in the distance, almost hidden by the swirling mist. "There is a way," the figure said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "But it comes at a price." Mark's heart pounded as he stared at the doorway. He didn't trust it, or the figure, but it was his only hope. "What price?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, fading into the mist like a shadow dissolving into the night. The doorway pulsed, brighter now, calling to him. Mark hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay put. But the shadows behind him stirred, the growls and whispers returning. With no other choice, Mark began to crawl toward the doorway. Mark dragged himself through the thick sludge, his hands sinking into the cold, sticky muck with every movement. The faint glow of the doorway ahead pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer as if urging him forward. Behind him, the shadows stirred restlessly, their guttural growls and whispers filling the air. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move despite the overwhelming exhaustion in his body. The cold clung to him like a second skin, chilling him to the bone. His arms trembled, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to stop. As he inched closer, the air grew heavier, pressing down on him with an almost tangible force. The whispers shifted, transforming into sharp, accusatory voices that seemed to come from deep within his mind. "You should have turned back," one voice hissed. "You ignored the warnings," another accused. "This is your fault," a third said, colder and more cutting than the rest. Mark clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I didn't know. I didn't choose this." The voices laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You always had a choice," they said in unison, their tone mocking. Mark shut his eyes tightly, blocking out the voices as best as he could. The glow of the doorway grew brighter, pulling him forward. He opened his eyes, focusing solely on the light ahead. "Just a little farther," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. The doorway loomed closer, its light almost blinding now. It was a simple archway, carved from smooth, black stone that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Beyond it, the glow was softer, warmer, promising a reprieve from the cold and darkness. Mark hesitated as he reached the threshold. The oppressive voices faded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the doorway itself. He peered through, but the space beyond was obscured by a swirling golden mist. "Go," a familiar voice urged, startling him. He turned to see the ethereal woman from before, standing several feet away. Her glowing eyes were filled with urgency. "You must go now, before it's too late." Mark looked back at the doorway, his heart pounding. "What's on the other side?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Your escape," she said simply. "Your way out." Her words should have comforted him, but there was something in her tone, a hint of sorrow, of warning, that made him hesitate. "What are you telling me?" he demanded, turning back to her. The woman's gaze softened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements as fluid as the mist around her. "You don't belong here, Mark," she said gently. "But if you hesitate any longer, you will." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting between her and the doorway. "What's the price?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression darkened, and she looked away. "The price is your past," she said after a long pause. "Everything you were, everything you knew, will be lost." Mark's stomach churned, and he shook his head. "No, that can't be right. I just want to go back to my life, my home." The woman's gaze snapped back to him, her glowing eyes piercing. "That life is already gone," she said, her voice firm. "The longer you stay here, the more this place claims you. This is your only chance." Mark's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his chest tightening with despair. "But I don't want to lose everything," he whispered. "I didn't ask for this." The woman knelt beside him, placing a cold, delicate hand on his shoulder. "Few do," she said softly. "But this is not a place of mercy, Mark. You must decide, leave everything behind and step through, or stay here and let the shadows consume you." Tears streamed down Mark's face as he looked at the doorway. The golden light seemed inviting, almost peaceful, but the weight of the woman's words pressed down on him like a crushing force. "What happens if I go through?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You'll survive," she said, "but you'll be someone else, somewhere else. Your memories, your identity, they will fade." Mark's mind options. Stay and face the torment of the shadows, or leave everything he knew behind and embrace the unknown. He thought of his life before the crash, his home, his friends, his family. The thought of losing it all made his chest ache. But the shadows behind him stirred again, their growls growing louder, more insistent. Mark turned to see them closing in, their twisted forms writhing like living nightmares. "There's no time," the woman urged, her voice rising with desperation. "Choose now." Mark looked at her, then at the doorway. The growls were deafening now, the shadows almost upon him. His body trembled as he forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. With one last, ragged breath, Mark stepped through the doorway. The light engulfed him, warm and blinding. The voices, the growls, the oppressive cold, all of it vanished in an instant. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and light. Then, the world shifted. Mark stumbled forward, the golden light fading as the world around him began to solidify. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust to this sudden change. The air was warm now, filled with the scent of earth and faint traces of wildflowers. He stood on a dirt path that stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by rolling hills bathed in soft twilight. His heart raced as he turned in circles, scanning his surroundings. The oppressive forest, the shadows, and the whispers, they were all gone. For a moment, he let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. But something felt off. Mark looked down at his hands. They were clean, free of the sludge that had clung to him moments before, but they didn't feel like his. His skin was smoother, the faint scars and calluses from years of work missing. He ran his hands over his face, noting the unfamiliar contours of his jaw and cheekbones. "What's happening?" He whispered to himself, his voice trembling. It sounded different, softer, lighter, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Ahead, the path forked into two directions, each leading toward a distant horizon. To his left, the hills rose into jagged peaks, shadowed and foreboding. To his right, the terrain softened into a lush valley, where faint lights flickered like fireflies in the distance. A voice broke the silence, startling him. "You've arrived." Mark spun around to see the ethereal woman once more. She stood a few paces behind him, her gown flowing as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her glowing eyes were softer now, almost kind, but there was a weight in her expression that sent a chill through him. What is this place?" Mark stammered. "Why do I feel different?" She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt path. "This is where your journey begins anew," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've crossed over, Mark. What you were before is gone." Mark shook his head, panic rising in his chest. No, this isn't right. I didn't agree to this. I just wanted to escape." "And you did," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "But escape has a cost." He staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him. "You said I'd survive," he said, his voice breaking. "You didn't say I'd lose myself." The woman tilted her head, her expression almost sorrowful. "You haven't lost everything," she said. "Fragments of who you were remain, enough to guide you forward, to help you find your way in this new existence." Mark's breathing grew shallow as the weight of her words sank in. "A new existence?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this." "Few do," she replied. "But the choice you made brought you here. Now, you must decide again." She gestured toward the two paths before him. "Each road leads to a different destiny," she explained. "The peaks will challenge you, test your strength, and force you to confront the darkness within. The valley offers comfort, ease, but at the cost of stagnation. Choose wisely." Mark stared at the paths, his mind racing. The jagged peaks loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching toward him like outstretched claws. The valley, by contrast, shimmered with an almost dreamlike quality, its lights warm and inviting. But something about the valley unsettled him. It felt too perfect, too easy. "I don't want either of these," he said, his voice shaking. I just want to go home. The woman's gaze hardened slightly. That door is closed, she said firmly. There is no going back. Tears welled in Mark's eyes, blurring his vision. Why me? He asked, his voice breaking. What did I do to deserve this? Her expression softened again, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. This isn't about deserving, she said. It's about what you do now with what you've been given. Mark pulled away, his frustration glaring. And what if I refuse? What if I just stay here? Her glowing eyes darkened, and the air around them grew heavier. Then you will fade, she said, her voice cold. This place does not allow idleness. It will consume you, piece by piece, until nothing remains. Mark's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, clutching his head. This isn't fair, he muttered, his voice cracking. This isn't fair. The woman knelt beside him, her tone softening. Fairness is not the nature of this place, she said. But survival is. And you can survive, Mark. You can thrive, if you make the choice. He looked up at her, his tear-streaked face a mask of despair. How do I know which path is right? He asked, his voice barely audible. She offered a faint, enigmatic smile. The answer lies within you, she said. But you must act. Time is running out. Mark stared at the forked paths, his mind a storm of doubt and fear. The peaks seemed insurmountable, the valley too good to be true. Both filled him with dread. The shadows began to stir again, their whispers faint but growing. The air chilled, and Mark knew his time was running out. With a deep, shuddering breath, he rose to his feet. His legs were unsteady, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to move. He stepped toward the fork, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. And then he chose. Mark stepped forward, the weight of his choice bearing down on him like a heavy stone. His feet carried him along the chosen path, a direction that felt both foreign and familiar, as if some unseen force had nudged him toward it. The air shifted, growing colder and heavier with each step. Behind him, the other path began to dissolve, swallowed by the swirling mist. The ethereal woman was gone, her cryptic words lingering in his mind like an echo. The faint whispers of the shadows faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Mark trudged onward, his steps slow and deliberate. The path wound sharply upward, the ground uneven and jagged beneath his feet. The terrain grew harsher, the soft dirt replaced by sharp, broken stones that dug into his soles. He looked up, squinting at the towering peaks that loomed ahead, their silhouettes cutting jagged lines against the darkening sky. Why did I choose this? He muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that swept through the pass. Why not the valley? The answer gnawed at him. Deep down, he knew the valley's promises of comfort and ease had been a trap. A siren's call meant to lure him into complacency. But this path felt like punishment. The wind howled louder, carrying with it faint, ghostly cries that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Mark pulled his jacket tighter around him, though it did little to shield him from the biting cold. The climb grew steeper, the path narrowing until it was barely wide enough for him to pass. He pressed on, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thinner here, each step more of a struggle than the last. The jagged peaks seemed impossibly far, no closer than when he had started. His legs burned, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that froze him in place. Mark turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he aimed it into the darkness. The beam cut through the swirling mist, revealing nothing but the barren landscape behind him. Yet the growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the air like a predator's warning. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice cracking. His words were swallowed by the wind, the growl rising in response. It was deep, feral, and unmistakably real. His pulse quickened as he scanned the darkness, his flashlight darting back and forth, The shadows seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of the beam, forming shapes that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. The growl came again, now accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. Mark's grip tightened on the flashlight. His knuckles whitened. He took a cautious step backward, his breath shallow and rapid. From the darkness emerged a creature, massive, hulking, and otherworldly. Its body was covered in matted fur, its limbs unnaturally elongated, ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face was a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast, its glowing eyes locked onto Mark with an unsettling intelligence. Mark stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stay back," he shouted, raising the flashlight as if it were a weapon. The creature snarled, its maw revealing rows of jagged teeth. It advanced slowly, its movements deliberate and predatory. Mark's legs trembled, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The creature lunged. Mark barely had time to react. He dove to the side, the claws grazing his shoulder and tearing through his jacket. Pain shot through him as he hit the ground hard, the flashlight tumbling from his grasp. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. The creature circled him, its glowing eyes burning with hunger. It growled again, low and menacing, as if savoring his fear. Mark backed away, his gaze darting around for anything he could use as a weapon. His hand brushed against a jagged piece of rock. He seized it, gripping it tightly despite the sharp edges cutting into his palm. "Come on," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You want me. Come and get me." The creature roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath him. It charged again, its claws raised. Mark swung the rock with all his strength, striking the creature's head. It let out a furious snarl, staggering back but not falling. Adrenaline surging through him as he sprinted up the narrow path. The growls and snarls of the creature echoed behind him, growing fainter with each step, but he didn't dare look back. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. The path suddenly opened up into a wide plateau. Mark skidded to a stop, his chest heaving as he scanned the area. In the center of the plateau stood a towering monolith, its surface smooth and black, pulsing faintly with an inner light. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing softly like embers. Mark approached cautiously, the oppressive weight of the monolith pressing down on him. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the surface. The symbols flared brighter, and a deep, resonant voice filled his mind. "You have faced the trial," it said, the words reverberating through his very soul. "But the journey is far from over." Mark's hand fell to his side, his body trembling. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The monolith pulsed again, its light growing stronger. "Prove your worth," the voice said. "Prove you are more than what you were." The ground beneath him began to shake, cracks forming in the plateau. Mark staggered back, his gaze darting around as the wind howled and the symbols on the monolith burned brighter. The creature's growl echoed once more, distant but approaching fast. Mark clenched his fists, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The monolith's light engulfed him, and the world around him shattered into darkness. Mark's eyes fluttered open to a vast expanse of white nothingness. He was lying on a cold, smooth surface that stretched endlessly in all directions. There were no shadows, no horizon, just an infinite void of blinding light. His body ached, his shoulders still throbbed from the creature's attack, and his palms were raw from gripping the jagged rock. He sat up, disoriented, his mind racing. "Where am I now?" he muttered, his voice echoing unnaturally, as though the void itself was repeating his words. "Welcome," a voice boomed, deep and resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the air and into his chest. Mark scrambled to his feet, his head whipping around as he searched for the source. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice laced with frustration and fear. The air shimmered in front of him, and a figure materialized, a tall, imposing silhouette cloaked in shadows. Its form was undefined, constantly shifting and rippling like smoke caught in a breeze. Two piercing, silver eyes glowed from within the darkness, locking onto Mark with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "You were at the threshold," the figure said, its voice calm yet commanding. "The final trial awaits." Mark's fists clenched, his jaw tightening. "I've had enough of these trials," he snapped. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose to be here." The figure tilted its head, its silver eyes narrowing. "Didn't you?" it asked, its tone almost mocking. "Every choice you made brought you here. Every step you took, every warning you ignored." Mark's anger flared, his voice rising. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to survive." The figure's eyes burned brighter, and the air around Mark grew heavier. "And now you must prove that you are worthy of survival," it said. "This is the moment of reckoning." The smooth ground beneath Mark's feet began to shift and ripple, the void around him growing darker. Shapes emerged from the whiteness, ghostly figures that solidified into familiar faces. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he recognized them. His family, his friends, people from his past. They stared at him with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and accusation. "You left us," one of them said, a voice Mark recognized as his mother's. "You abandoned us." "No," Mark whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true." "You failed us," another voice said, this one his best friend from childhood. "You were selfish. You didn't care." Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding. "I didn't mean to," he shouted. "I didn't know this would happen." The figures stepped closer, their voices blending into a haunting chorus of blame and regret. The air grew colder, their accusations cutting into him like shards of ice. "You have always run from the truth," the shadowed figure said, its voice echoing above the cacophony. "Now, you must face it." The ground beneath Mark cracked, splitting open to reveal an abyss of swirling darkness. The ghostly figures surrounded him, their hands reaching out, their hollow eyes boring into him. "Stop!" Mark screamed, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." The figures froze, their expressions softening slightly. The shadowed figure stepped forward, its silver eyes piercing through the chaos. "Regret is not enough," it said. "To move forward, you must release what binds you. You must let go of the pain, the guilt, the fear." Mark fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to let go." The shadowed figure extended a hand, its form solidifying slightly. "You must choose," it said. "Hold onto your past and remain trapped, or release it and find freedom." The ghostly figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The void grew silent, the only sound Mark's ragged breathing. He looked up at the shadowed figure, his chest heaving with emotion. "What happens if I let go?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You will be free," the figure said simply. "But freedom comes with uncertainty. You will not be who you were, nor will you know who you will become." Mark's heart ached as he thought of his life, his family, his friends, everything he had known. The memories felt like chains, heavy and unyielding, but they were also all he had left of himself. The void around him darkened further, the cracks in the ground widening. The shadowed figure's hand remained outstretched, waiting. Mark closed his eyes, his mind a storm of fear and doubt. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then reached out, his fingers brushing against the figure's hand. A surge of warmth and light enveloped him, and the ground beneath him crumbled away. He fell into the abyss, the darkness swallowing him whole. Mark's eyes opened slowly, his vision adjusting to a dim, golden glow. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and fresh earth. He lay on his back, staring up at a sky painted with swirling hues of amber and violet, as though caught in an eternal sunset. The weight that had pressed on his chest for what felt like an eternity was gone. He sat up, his movements tentative, as though testing his own body. Everything felt different, lighter, freer. His hands no longer trembled, and the deep ache in his shoulder was gone. He looked down at himself, realizing that the grime, the blood, and even the clothes he had been wearing were all gone. In their place was a simple, clean tunic of soft, unrecognizable fabric. Mark stood, his legs steady beneath him. The ground beneath his feet was soft and lush, a sprawling meadow stretching as far as the eye could see. Wildflowers of every imaginable color dotted the landscape, their petals glowing faintly in the golden light. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it a soothing hum like a distant melody. "Where am I?" Mark murmured, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like forever. The voice answered, soft and familiar. "You've reached the other side." Mark turned to see the ethereal woman standing a few paces away, her flowing gown blending seamlessly with the glowing flowers. Her glowing eyes were no longer piercing but warm, filled with a quiet wisdom. She smiled, a gesture that carried both comfort and finality. "Is this freedom?" he asked, his voice laced with hesitation. The woman nodded. "It is. You let go of the chains that bound you. This is your new beginning." Mark's mind raced, the weight of her words sinking in. "But I don't remember who I was," he said, panic flickering in his chest. "My family, my life, it's all gone." She stepped closer, her expression calm but firm. "You chose to release the past," she said. "The pain, the fear, the guilt, you left it behind so you could move forward. What lies ahead is yours to shape." Mark frowned, his hands clenching at his sides. "What does that even mean? I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to lose everything." Her gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Loss and freedom are intertwined," she said gently. "To break free, you must let go. What you had is gone, yes, but what you can create now is limitless." Mark pulled away, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Limitless?" he echoed, his voice rising. "I didn't ask for limitless. I just wanted to go home. I wanted my life back." The woman's eyes glowed faintly, her tone firm. "Your old life no longer exists. What was familiar, what was safe, is behind you. Clinging to it would have destroyed you." Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight dragging from him. He sank to the ground, a soft mass cushioning his fall. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore." The woman knelt beside him, her voice soft and steady. "You are whoever you choose to be," she said. "This is a place of beginnings, not endings. You are free to create, to explore, to live without the weight of what once was." Mark stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. But beneath it all, a flicker of something new stirred, a fragile spark of hope. He looked out over the endless meadow, the golden light bathing the world in warmth. The hum in the air grew louder, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sensation. Then a voice, soft, gentle, and familiar, whispered in his ear. "You are free." "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. The woman smiled, standing and extending her hand to him. "Now, you take your first step." Mark hesitated for a moment before reaching up and taking her hand. As she pulled him to his feet, a sense of calm washed over him, pushing away the lingering fear. He looked at her, then at the vast expanse before him. "Where does this path lead?" he asked, his voice steady. Her smile widened, and she gestured toward the horizon. "Wherever you wanted to." Mark took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling into his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, the suffocating pressure was gone. He took a step forward, then another, the soft grass beneath his feet feeling strangely alive. The woman's voice followed him, calm and unwavering. "Remember, Mark, this is your story." As he walked into the golden horizon, the melody in the air swelled, filling him with a quiet determination. The past was behind him, the future uncertain, but for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in a long time.